So the perineum is a region between the thighs, and the borders of the perineum are, when you look in the front, we have what's known as the pubic symphysis. So this would be pubic symphysis, and let me just fill it in. Pubic symphysis. On the two sides, we have what's known as issue tuberosity, 1, 2. We can say issue tuberosity. In the back, we have what's called coccyx. So we can say sacrum and coccyx. So we can say just use the word coccyx. All right. Now the perineum can be subdivided to two triangles, one in the front and one in the back. In the front, it's going to be known as, so the front one is anterior. It's known as urogenital triangle. So this is going to be anterior triangle. And the reason why it's called urogenital triangle is because it's involved with the urinary and the genitalia, external genitalia. So in this case, in the female, there are two orifices in the female found in the urogenital triangle. Two orifices. One orifice is going to be known as the anterior orifice, is known as urethral orifice, and posterior vaginal orifice. Now, in the male, you have the base of the penis and the scrotum in the urogenital triangle. And so, in the base of the male, in the male, you have the base of the penis and the scrotum. In the urogenital triangle, in the female, you have two orifices. One is called the urethral orifice, and the back is known as the vaginal orifice. For both gender, the anal triangle is going to be the posterior triangle. And both genders, the anal triangle contains the anus. So we can say the triangles in the perineum can be divided into urogenital triangle and anal triangle in the back. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, we're going to begin with the female reproductive anatomy. So what I urge that you know is this. I'm going to use this image on exam, except it's a blank image, and you need to know how to label the structures I'm about to go over. And on the exam, I will ask the functions of those structures. Make sure you know them. Let's begin with the ovaries. The ovaries would be a part of the primary organs or gonads. So the ovaries is the primary organ or gonad in female. Now we know for a fact is the primary functions are they produce egg cells or oocytes and hormones. Right. Now, in this case, the sex hormones are known as estrogen and progesterone. All right. Now, what I also need for you to know is this: is that when you look at the ovaries, the two regions, we can say the two regions are going to be known as the cortex and medulla. So the cortex, the medulla contains blood vessels and nerve, Well, the cortex contains follicles as well as and the corpus luteum and albicans. And as you see from the image at the very bottom of this, the image at the very bottom, we have what's known as the stages of follicular development. So let's begin with the first original of the follicles are called primordial follicles. So these primordial follicles will develop into what's called primary follicles. So not all of them will become primary. Only a few become primary. And of the primary follicles, only one become what's known as secondary follicle. Now the secondary follicle would become, so there's only one secondary follicle, and this secondary follicle will become what's called graphene follicle, or aka vesicular follicle. Now, the vesicular follicle will rupture during ovulation. When it ruptures during ovulation, the egg will come out. It releases the egg, and the egg goes into the fallopian tube. Now, the remaining of the graphene follicle will become what's known as the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum will last for 2 weeks before it becomes corpus albicans. So the corpus luteum basically is that remains functional for 2 weeks, okay? Unless unless pregnancy or unless fertilization of the or unless the fertilized egg is embedded in the uterus or is implanted in the uterus, I should say implanted in the uterus, um, in which the corpus luteum will remain functional for longer period of time. So the corpus luteum remains functional for 2 weeks unless the fertilized egg is implanted in the uterus, in which the corpus luteum will remain functional for a longer period. Now, once the corpus luteum exceeds its function, it becomes corpus albicans. So keep in mind this is that if there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum lasts for 2 weeks, and it then becomes corpus albicans. So the question is this: what is the function of the corpus luteum? Why does it only last for 2 weeks unless pregnancy occurs? And what is being produced by the corpus luteum? So let's discuss this right now. So the corpus luteum produces what's known as so the corpus luteum, what it does is that it secretes function, produces progesterone. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone, so which means it's going to last for 2 weeks unless pregnancy were to happen, and then when that happens, that means the corpus luteum remains functional for a longer period of time. Now, if pregnancy doesn't happen, What will happen is going to be what? If pregnancy doesn't happen, this corpus luteum will become corpus albicans. So what exactly are corpus albicans? Well, corpus albicans basically are scar tissues or fibrous tissues. You know, so it's fibrous tissue formed after it's a part of the healing process of the rupturing of the graphene follicle. So once the graphene follicle ruptures, the corpus albicans is the end product of it, which means it's this fibrous tissue. So you can see the development of the follicles, and so we can say is this primordial follicles are abundant. Now, only a few of them becomes what's known as primary follicles. Now, only one of the primary follicles will become secondary, and the secondary follicle will enlarge in size to become graphene follicle. Graphene is a correct spelling. There's only one F. Graphene follicle will rupture and the egg is released into the fallopian tube, and then the remaining of the graphene follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum persists for 2 weeks unless pregnancy were to happen. If there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum will become corpus albicans, which is fibrous tissues. All right, moving on to the next slide, we're moving into the fallopian tube. So the purpose of the fallopian tube is a passage. So what it does is it connects or it transports the egg from the ovary into the uterus. Now it's 4 inches in length. Okay. Now keep in mind this, it's 4 inches in length, correct? 4 inches in length. That's not much when you think about it. So the fallopian tube transports the egg from the ovary into the uterus. It has a 4 inch in length, and the whole transport process of the egg requires 3 days. The duration of the transport will be egg from ovary in 3 days. But the egg is only usable within the first 24 hours. It's only usable during the first 24 hours. In the first 24 hours post ovulation. So what that means is this, is that once ovulation occurs, the sperm should be working its way up to fertilize the egg within the fallopian tube, because after the first 24 hours, the egg is no longer usable, and so as it works its way down into the uterus. So it's 4 inches in length, but it requires 3 days for the transport process of the egg into the uterus. Now, let's talk about the regions of the fallopian tube. So the region itself is going to be 4 regions. We are going to begin with the proximal region, moving on to distal, using the ovary as the point of reference. Okay. So first we can say is that the infundibulum, the first region is going to be called infundibulum. Are we okay? Very good. Okay. With fimbriae. Okay. Now, what exactly are fimbriae is basically is fimbriae are finger-like structures, okay, used in pulling, used in creating a creating waves to pull the egg into the fallopian tube post ovulation. So once the ovary once ovulation occurs, the egg is being pulled by these waves created by the fimbriae. So it pulls in the egg into the fallopian tube. So you can see right here is that the rupturing of the follicle will push the egg out of the ovary, and the force produced, or the waves generated by the infimbrae, and these are the fimbriae right here, by the way, fimbriae. So you can see basically this, I'll just label it as fimbriae. And these represent what's known as the fimbriae. And these represent what's known as the finger-like structures that pull the egg into the fallopian tube. The next portion is called the ampulla. So the ampulla is by far the widest portion in the ampulla. Is the widest region within the fallopian tube. Within the fallopian tube, where the sperm fertilizes the egg. The next portion is going to be called the isthmus. The isthmus represents basically is the constricted portion of the ampulla. So when the ampulla constricts, it becomes a isthmus. And the last portion is going to be known as the interstitial portion of the uterine part, or interstitial part. And this portion is found within the wall of the fallopian end of the uterus. So once again, this is the four regions. The fallopian tube divides into four portions. The first portion is going to be known as infundibulum. That this region is proximal to the ovary. The second region is going to be known as the ampulla. It's the widest portion of the fallopian tube. The isthmus is going to be the constricted portion of the ampulla. And the fourth one is going to be known as the uterine part, or interstitial part, which is going to be found within the wall of the uterus. So we have the fallopian tube. Done. Let's move on to the next one. Is that uterus. The function of the uterus is basically is that first it serves as a part of the reproductive tract. So that's the first function. It serves as a part of the reproductive tract. Now the second function is going to be it houses the embryo or fetus. And when you actually houses, that's where pregnancy occurs, meaning that the fertilized egg implanted. So what that means is this: fertilized egg implanted within the uterus. Now the regions of the uterus, will begin with the first one called the fundus. Okay. It's a dome-shaped region. So this region right here is called a fundus right here. And from the fundus goes into what's known as the body. The body is the widest portion, and it goes into what's called the isthmus. Once again, isthmus is a constrict, constricted portion. So this is wider, and for that reason, it's called the body. And when it constricts, it becomes the isthmus. And the last portion is the cervix. Okay. The cervix is the neck of the uterus. Okay, so it's not an organ, it's just a neck of the uterus. It's just a region within the uterus. Now we're moving on to the wall of the uterus, beginning from the outside, moving on to the inside. So the wall has three layers beginning from the perimetrium, which is going to be the outer layer of the wall. Myometrium is going to be the middle layer, and this is going to be middle layer. This layer contains muscle. So let me go back to perimetrium, the outer layer. Myometrium, the middle layer contains smooth muscle. So during contraction, okay, um, during contraction, the myometrium contracts to expel the baby out of the uterus. Endometrium is the inner layer, and the endometrium, basically what it does is it lines the 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 internal layer lines the internal space of the uterus. Now, it's composed of two layers, the functional layer, superficial functional layer, and the basal layer. Now, what I need for you to know is that during menses, the functional layer is sloughed off, and the and afterwards, the basal layer thickens to become the new functional layer. Okay. So the functional layer slops off during menses, and the basal layer grows upward or pushes upward and starts to grow and becomes thicker, and it starts to push upward and becomes a new functional layer. However, the basal layer basically stays the same. In the sense is that it's still a basal layer, so it's not a functional layer. It just as it becomes thicker and grows upward, the upward part becomes a new functional layer. All right, moving on to the vagina. Vagina is a fibromuscular tube of anywhere between 4 to 6 inches in length. And the vagina basically is serves as a purpose. And when you think of them, oops, so the vagina basically is often referred to as the birth canal. And simply what it is it's a passage. It's simply a passage. Okay? And it's a passage for various things. Okay? So it's a passage for sperm cells transmitted from the male into the female. So it's a passage. And for sperm cells. Okay? And also it's just a passage for the baby to come out. So for that reason, it's called a birth canal. And so it's a passage also is like for the blood to come out from menses or during menses. Okay. So it's a passage for blood to come out during menses. Also blood for baby to come out of the birth canal. So the vagina in this case is also called the birth canal. Also, this is a passage for sperm cells to be passed on from male to female. Okay. Now, in the vagina, there are what's called rugae, and we know rugae are defined as mucosal folds. So these are called mucosal folds. Now, I'm going to ask you questions. Name other structures that you know of that also contain rugae. Name other structures that you know of that also contains rugae besides the vagina. Good. I hear stomach. Yes. One more. Oh, just give me another one that I've taught you guys so far. Good. Urinary bladder. Very good. Yeah. So the mucosal folds allow the vagina to expand um, as needed. Okay, I'll leave it as that. All right. Um, let's move on. All right. So uterus, membrane, fallopian tube, vagina, bladder. So notice in this case is the uterus sits on top of the bladder, okay, which limits the expansion of the bladder. For that reason, women have less volume capacity. Not that the bladder is not big enough, but because the uterus sits on top of the bladder, for that reason, it limits the expansion of the bladder, and for that reason, the volume capacity in female is not as high as male. Good, let's move on. So let's move on to the next slide. Now the vulva or the pudendum is known as external genitalia in female. Let's begin with what we see from the outside is labia majora and minora. So as you know, labia majora is the larger portion and more. The labia majora is more external and larger, that's obvious. But what it is it contains hair, glands, the labia minora would be internal and smaller, internal and smaller, containing melanocytes and so containing melanocytes which are going to be containing melanocytes and more vascularity. So the labia minora is internal and smaller, and it contains melanocytes and more vascularity, while the labia majora contains hair and glands such as oil and sweat gland. Now, vestibule is a region, okay? It's a space defined as a space in between the labia minora. In this space, there are There are openings as well as glands. So the opening are known as orifice, which are openings. Fancy term for opening. And you have two openings, the urethral orifice, which is more anterior, and the vaginal orifice, which is more posterior. The next one's going to be known as, within this region as well, this space as well, we have what's called vestibular glands, and this gland produces mucus. So this gland secretes mucus, and it resembles secretes mucus. The glands resemble to the oval urethral gland of the male. Now, the mons pubis is in front of the pubic symphysis and is hairy and contains fat or lipids. The clitoris is anterior to the urethral opening orifice, but also what it is that it resembles to the penis. Okay? But unlike the penis, the clitoris only has two corpora cavernosa and no corpus spongiosum. So for that reason, the purpose of the clitoris is, so the clitoris can, so unlike the penis, the clitoris can only become erect and not made for the purpose of um, urination because of the lack of corpus spongiosum along with the urethra. So I want you to know this is that the clitoris is anterior to the urethral orifice and it resembles the penis in the male. Unlike the penis, the clitoris only has two corpora cavernosa and no corpus spongiosum. Unlike the penis, the clitoris can only become erect and not made for the purpose of urination because of the lack of the corpus spongiosum along with the urethra. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So this is for fun. Okay, so I won't ask you this on the exam, but I just want you to know. Okay, so when you look at the physiological cycles, that means for every cycle, we're assuming the average cycle is 28 days. Let's use that as for comparison purposes. So the first one we have is going to be known as the ovarian cycle. So a physiological cycle includes the ovarian and uterine cycles. So the first one represents what's called ovarian cycle, which in this case, ovarian cycle, which examines the changes of the follicles within the ovary. So you see right here is this. So these are the hormones that produce. So the FSH and LH are hormones produced by the hormones produced in the pituitary on the ovaries. So FSH and LH act on the ovary. So FSH promotes the development of the, so promotes, FSH promotes development of the follicles. FSH promotes the development of the follicles, whereas LH and there's a surge in LH causing ovulation. The LH during the luteal phase maintains the corpus luteum. So once again, it says in the ovarian cycle, there are two phases. Follicular phase and luteal phase. Okay. So during the ovarian cycle, there are two phases: the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And the follicular phase is governed by the FSH. And the luteal phase is governed by the LH. Now let's move down to the next one. So these hormones are produced by, so these are the hormones produced by the, so these are the hormones produced in the ovary: estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. So hormones produced in the ovaries to act on the uterus. And this would be known as the uterine cycle. So you can see changes in the endometrium of the uterus. And there are three phases, which is going to be proliferative, which is governed by estrogen, secretory, which is governed by progesterone, and menses, which is governed by none. So when you look at the uterine cycle, you can see menses means period. So during menses, the blood vessel is cut off, and for that reason, the tissues would die because there's no blood vessel, there's no blood supply, and when they die, they are sloughed off, and the bleeding that comes out is a result of the death of these tissues. In the proliferative, the functional layer becomes thicker over time. In the secretory phase, the functional layer becomes thicker and thicker, and for that reason is called the secretory phase. Oh, also there's more glandular activity involved during the secretory phase. By the way, this is for FYI, just to make sure that you guys know the whole purpose of these phases. So usually it takes about 28 days. The first 14 and the second 14. So you can see right here is this follicular phase and luteal phase. Follicular phase is governed by FSH, and luteal phase is governed by LH. So you can always refer this back to the previous slide for more details. In the uterine cycle, you can see that there are three phases. So menstrual phase or the menses, proliferative phase, which is going to be known as the second phase, and this is governed by what's called the FSH, or the estrogen, I should say, estrogen, not FSH, estrogen, and this, the third one is going to be known as secretory phase, in which there's more glands and there's more glandular activity and there's more mucus production, which blocks the cervix, so the sperm cells cannot go up. So all these are going to be FYI for fun. Now the last one is this: is that you can actually see, and this is also for FYI, you can see the functional layer becomes thicker over time. Nancy's very thin. Proliferative phase is getting thicker. Secretory phase is going to get thicker, thicker. Now, what follows this is going to be called Nancy. So it would drop very quick. Now, I also need for you to know the effect of the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen inhibits bone breakdown. So it prevents osteoporosis. Estrogen also stimulates female pattern of fat deposit and hair growth. So if you recall what I said, subcutaneous fat deposit. Estrogen also increases the retention of sodium and water, causing what's known as edema. So water and sodium combined will increase the water retention in the body. So estrogen also raises LDL, HDL, and lower LDL, so it's cardioprotective. Estrogen is involved with secondary sex female characteristics. And the last but not least, estrogen has anabolic effects on female, which means that the female structures, as well as progesterone, increase body temperature. If you notice, not if you notice, but when before ovulation or before menses were to begin, the body temperature rises, and the reason why it rises is because due to progesterone, it rises body temperature. So I expect you to know these two hormones, and the previous, I believe, three slides, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 3, I won't ask you on these because why? They are the same thing as this one. So except it's a bit more enlarged. But if you know this, you can answer the question. Anyhow, so write down your questions and I would answer those questions in the Q&A section of the class.